Good evening, everyone. I'm Allan, Carey, Director of Sphere Education Initiatives. It's so wonderful to have you all joining us this evening for another Sphere webinar. Tonight, we're going to be talking about youth mental health and the role of social media. So thinking about this through the lens of tech policy, how we ought as a society approach some of the more monumental questions about youth mental health, the relationship with technology, and some of the various proposals that have been considered for how we might help things move in the right direction. Very excited for the conversation this evening. I also wanted to pause here at the beginning and talk a little bit about Civic Learning Week. As many of you may know, today begins Civic Learning Week in the United States, an annual celebration where organizations, schools, educators from all around the country highlight some of the most important conversations in advancing civics education in America. And if you're a Sphere educator, you know that in our case, all education is civics education. We work with educators from all fields, all disciplines on the important ideas of civil discourse, openness, pluralism, engaging a wide variety of viewpoints, and the important role that educators play in shaping the next generation of adults to be productive, thoughtful, engaged members of society. So thank you all for what you do, and I do encourage you throughout the course of this week to check in on so many of the amazing organizations offering really exciting Civic Learning Week materials. As a reminder, this conversation, as all when it comes to Sphere lessons and Sphere webinars, is designed to promote that measure of civil discourse. We bring together scholars and experts to engage in some of the most challenging issues of the day in a way that models that measure of civil discourse. In turn, we ask that as you engage in the chat and in the conversation with each other, you model that same kind of behavior and that measure of respect and dignity that you treat others throughout the conversation in there. One final note and reminder as we're getting started. If you would like to receive professional development credit for attending tonight's webinar, it is important that as you take a look at your name as it shows up in the participants box, and make sure that matches the name that you registered with when you signed up for the event. Otherwise, we have a delightful trying to guess who it was that was actually here. So if you're new to that, hover over your name, right-click, click on rename, or just click there on rename. That'll give you the opportunity to put your name in there. That helps our team out tremendously. So without further ado, let me jump into introducing tonight's speakers. We've got an excellent lineup in front of us. So first, let me introduce my colleague, Jennifer Huddleston. She's a senior fellow in technology policy at the Cato Institute. Her research focuses on the intersection of emerging technology and law, with a particular interest in the interactions between technology and the administrative state. Huddleston's work covers topics including antitrust, online content moderation, data privacy, and the benefits of technology and innovation. You can find her published work widely in a variety of different outlets. Joining Jennifer tonight is Clare Morell, who's a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, where she directs EPPC's Technology and Human Flourishing Project. Prior to joining EPPC, Ms. Morell worked in both the White House Counsel's Office and the Department of Justice, as well as the private and nonprofit sectors. She's also the author of the forthcoming book, The Tech Exit, a practical guide to freeing kids and teens from smartphones, which will be released by Penguin Random House on June 3rd and is available for pre-order now. Jennifer, Clare, thank you both so much for joining us this evening. Really excited about this conversation. It's a topic that we've frequently heard from the teachers and educators in our network that they're passionately concerned about. So as many have pointed out, including Jonathan Haidt in his recent Anxious Generation work and other places, there's a growing concern among people that things like cell phones and social media in particular have been harmful or potentially harmful on the mental health of a wide variety of people. Now, lots of debate about how much that's true and what the causes are and the medicinal characteristics of that. But setting aside looking at it from a medical point of view, we want to talk a little bit about the tech policy piece in particular. How ought we approach these conversations as a society? I suppose to begin with, it's helpful to get a little bit of a lay of the land. What's the conversation that's happening out there when it comes to thinking about what's the argument people are making, the case advocating for or against some measure of heavier involvement in limitations on youth participation in social media. Jennifer, let me turn to you first. You've got I love your perspective because it says, yes, if there are harms here, there's some interesting things to look at. But as we think about it, it isn't necessarily obvious that a legal or regulatory approach is perhaps the right way to go. Share us a little bit about how you take a look at the landscape now and some of the key thoughts in your argument.
Thank you, Alan, and thank you for having me tonight. It's always great to be here at Sphere. Before I went into the public policy world, I was actually a K-12 teacher myself for 3 years, teaching upper elementary school and lower middle school math in the Mississippi Delta and at a charter school in Houston, Texas. So I certainly am always happy to see teachers really engaged in these conversations and really setting up to model to their students and have important conversations around this. The first thing I want to go to on this first question, though, is I think a lot of what matters and a lot of where the debate and perhaps even the divergence on the debate occurs is the question of who is the we in the question you asked, Alan. When you say, what ought we to do about young people in social media? Is the we the government? Is the we as adults who are trying to set good examples for younger users? Is the we parents, teachers, community? Because I think that what we ought to do is going to vary depending on that answer. The short version is I don't think there's a one size fits all solution, just as there are with many issues. The reality is why a young person is on social media, what they're choosing to do on social media, how much time they're spending on social media, and the underlying questions about why are going to vary from household to household as well as from young person to young person. The same thing about those concerns. Some parents have some of the more traditional concerns we've seen since the start of the internet, concerns about online predators or concerns about their child meeting up with someone or physical safety type of things. Some have more concerns about cyberbullying or what their young people may be doing with students with other students their own age. Others just have concerns about the sheer amount of time the young person is spending or the type of content that they may be seeing that goes against their potential household values. The reason I point out all those different things is we can't necessarily agree on what that actual concern about young people and social media is. And even within the same household, a parent of two teenagers may have different concerns for one child and another. So if we can't agree on the problem, it's really hard to come up with that top-down policy level solution. Not to mention, there's also going to be the question of trade-offs. Even if we are, say, concerned about the amount of time a young person is spending on social media, if we start seeing the state intervene in that, the question is, and by the state, I mean the government, whether it's a federal government or a state government. I'm sure we'll get into some of the various policies that have been proposed in either a young person's access to social media or the amount of time they can spend on social media or the type of content they might be able to access on social media. The problem is that we're also often going to interfere with adults' speech rights as well, because typically the only way to know someone is not under whatever age these laws set, is to also confirm that everyone is over those age. The other issue here is that a lot of these proposals assume a positive relationship in the household, that children can go to their parents and ask for permission, that their parents are going to be the decision makers there, and that there's going to be a positive relationship. Unfortunately, that means that it's going to be very hard on some of the people, young people for whom the internet has been a literal lifeline at times. Young people who may be questioning their sexuality and not ready to have those conversations with their parents. Youth in foster care or youth who are experiencing abuse at home where the parent may actually be the abuser and are trying to use the internet as a way to get help from that abuse. And oftentimes there's little remedy to kind of deal with those exceptional cases when we're talking about something at law versus things that as a community can be understood. Finally, and I don't want to take up too much time because I'm sure Claire has thoughts too. I think the other question is not only trade-offs, but are we asking the deeper questions about why? Why are young people choosing to be online? Are we asking the young people themselves these questions and not just making presumptions as adults? Is it because this is where they have community? Is it because this is where they're learning a specific new skill? Or is it because this is the kind of third space or the safe place that they have to go because they don't have access to some of those traditional places where maybe we would have gone when we were young teens and gone to public parks or libraries or local hangouts that may or may not exist in that community? And if so, is that something the community wants to consider providing as well?
Jennifer, thanks for that introduction. Claire, let me turn it to you. I know you look at it in a different perspective than Jennifer. How do you approach these questions?
Yes, no, and Jennifer, thank you for just teeing us up. I feel like I can just now kind of respond to a lot of the points that you brought up, but perhaps from a different perspective. So I would say I actually feel like I do have an answer to the why question. And that is actually why I've advocated for a lot of the policies I have, which is that the technologies that are really kind of, I think we're particularly talking about, not the internet as a whole, but smartphones and social media in particular are designed to be extremely addictive to children. And this has become apparent just from brain studies and brain imaging studies, just how the way that these technologies are operating and the way that they affect a child's brain is very different than an adult's. Children's brains are still developing. And particularly between the ages of 10 to 12, the brain's dopamine receptors are multiplying. And it's a neurotransmitter that gives a burst of pleasure. And these technologies are designed to deliver these constant dopamine hits. And dopamine just creates a craving for more. It never produces satisfaction. And so addiction scientists actually measure how addictive something is by how much dopamine is released in the brain and how quickly it's released. And so studies have shown that social media has effects on the brain similar to very highly addictive drugs. And so in my mind, it compels us to treat it as a harmful substance or a harmful technology for children just by the nature of its design. So setting aside what kind of content children may be accessing on social media apps, the design itself underlying these platforms is very harmful to a child's developing brain. A study came out of the University of North Carolina in 2023 that was actually one of the first longitudinal studies done on children in social media and found that children who frequently check social media, not even how much time they're spending on the platform per se, because say a parent sets a 30-minute time limit, but just how many times they're checking the app during the day, the kind of heavy checkers of social media had divergent brain development over time and became much more overly sensitized to the kind of online rewards and a really kind of negative feedback loop. And so I think it's just important taking a step back to kind of ask what the business model is behind these products that are being really heavily promoted to children. And these companies are not neutral. They want users to spend as much time and attention and data as possible on their platforms because they sell that to advertisers. And so for me, the business model is really inherently predatory, particularly towards children, wanting to maximize their time and attention. And I think that if you are a parent or an educator, we see this just observationally that children are really glued to their phones and their devices. And I think that to me just it shows how addicting it is. I don't think a kid holding a book is constantly looking down at their book and flipping through pages, but the same with a phone in their hand, they're constantly glued to the screen. And so I think that compels me to then think about the way that we have treated other kind of harmful products that by design are detrimental to children, like tobacco or alcohol, or even technologies that we just recognize take a certain maturity to operate, like driving a car or operating a firearm. We've age restricted them. And so I've advocated for public policy solutions to raise the age of social media or to age restrict it. Or as Jennifer was alluding to, there's a lot of state laws that have been passed requiring parental consent to get on social media. And I would just say, that's not to the internet as a whole. I don't think we're trying to say children should have no access to the internet, but just to certain platforms that have been deemed to be harmful to children. A parent should really have oversight into a child being allowed to access that platform, particularly because children are actually entering into contracts with these companies saying that, yes, you can collect these things about me. I'm agreeing to your terms of service. That in the real world, we don't recognize that children have a right to form legally enforceable contracts. So trying to put the parent really back in the driver's seat. And then the last thing I'll say, I know we have a lot to get into, but the other reason that to me really necessitates a collective public policy solution to the effects we're seeing of social media and smartphones on children is the network effects that these technologies create. that the harms are actually not on an individual level, but they're collective in how they've changed the entire social environment and social dynamics for children, such that even parents who may decide to keep their children off of social media or without a smartphone feel like their children can still suffer costs and harms because then they can still feel the kind of effects of anxiety or depression or loneliness by feeling left out of what is happening, since the entire way that teens are socializing today is through these mediums. And so to me, the best solution is to push these things out of childhood. And I think public policy solutions from the government can be a helpful aid to parents. But parents and schools and communities don't have to wait on the government. I'm very hopeful that I feel like more and more communities are coming together to try to delay smartphones and social media for children, and schools and parents working together can really help provide those collective solutions. So I'm eager to talk about that as well, that we don't have to only rely on public policy solutions, but that just by parents banding together and schools working with parents can help to mitigate some of those negative effects to provide a really kind of real life in-person childhood. And for parents that do want to opt out, make it more possible for them to do so by protecting the environment, particularly during the school day.
I don't know about so many of our listeners here tonight, but I had an unhealthy relationship with books as a child and more than once was banned from bringing them into the restaurant with me as a kid.
If I may say, there are old headlines from like the turn of the 19th century about how kids these days are reading too many novels. So, that we have had these fears even about books. We've also seen headlines about teenage telephone addiction going back to, I think it's about the 1970s, talking about landlines and things like that. So if sorry to interrupt the
oh no, I wish that was the problem we had today.
I think, yeah, I mean, but I bring this up in some ways to say, I first off, I would commend the work of my colleague, Dr. Jeff Singer, who has kind of looked at some of the studies. He's a medical doctor. This is not a diagnosed addiction in the way that we see other addictions diagnosed. And I know there is debate around those reactions and things in the medical community. So I just wanted to point to that. But I bring this up more because I do think it shows that we've in some ways been here before as a society with concerns about how our young people are using a technology. And we've found ways to evolve with that in society to the point that now we all laugh about, yeah, as a kid, I wasn't allowed to bring books into the restaurant. Or isn't it silly to think that in the 1900s, they thought kids were reading too many dime store novels or whatever. And so that's why one of the reasons I'm actually optimistic that there is a societal solution, as you mentioned, teachers and parents and other community members working together, as opposed to perhaps a more top-down policy, legal type of solution.
So lots of really interesting things here. I want to just perhaps spend a minute or two talking about something you both hit on briefly, which was that notion that there may be voluntary solutions to some of the perceived challenges here. And I think this is an interesting area of agreement between the two of you. Claire, you mentioned a little bit about parents or schools approaching this and looking at that. I know it's part of the theme of your upcoming book is taking a look at phone-free schools and some of the mechanisms by which that might happen. But for both of you, what are some of those areas where you agree when it comes to thinking about things like either voluntary or community solutions or parental solutions, or other areas where we're taking a look at the problem more broadly and say, we might be able to find something good here separate from having to go so far as legal or regulatory action?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm happy to jump in since you mentioned my book. So my book, The Tech Exit, will come out June 3rd, and it's really meant to be a very positive and practical guidebook for parents for how to kind of free childhood from all of the screens. And I realize maybe not every parent wants to do that, but I feel like more often than not, I am meeting parents who want to opt out, that they want their kids to have a childhood more filled with real life experiences and interactions. And they're struggling to opt out because they feel like these technologies are just inevitable during childhood. And so I really set out to find families that had opted out and ask them how they had done this. And so my book really distills those principles for parents. How can I have a tech exit childhood where we really delay smartphones and social media until closer to adulthood? And so one of the the first and most important principle of the book is just finding other families. That because there is a communal and social aspect to these technologies, that it is much easier for your children to have friends and for you to have parents who are allies in this with you to find other families. And you can do that through your school or your neighborhood or your church or your religious community. And so I offer kind of parents a lot of examples of how other families have done this. And then I also talk about the role that schools can play. I think more and more schools are actually going phone free, which is amazing. It's just an amazing antidote to really protect the school environment, not just the classroom instruction, but bell to bell, no phones, so that during passing periods, during lunches, recesses, homeroom times, the kids are actually interacting with each other. They're not staring down at their phones. And I think that's really powerful, even if when they leave the school day, go back to their phones, to have the social and learning environment in the school day free from phones helps kids whose parents have opted them out to feel like they can still have friends and be part of the social interactions. And it helps the kids even that do have screens to have a more balanced relationship, that they get to spend the school day really in person with their teachers, with their peers. And then schools can actually really encourage cultural change in the community. So I highlight in the book examples of some towns, entire towns in Ireland and in England, really kind of adopting a voluntary pact to delay smartphones for kids until a certain age, whether it be 14 or 15. And it really started with a school principal sending a letter out to parents saying, hey, we want to be a town where we delay smartphones, and not just during the school day, but actually after school too. And so that in the communities, in the neighborhoods, these kids are actually playing with each other. And so that's really powerful. And the parents said it was really great for them because they felt like they could kind of make the school the bad guy to say, hey, the school really wants us to delay smartphones, and everyone else is doing it too. And so I think the collective solutions just make it easier on each individual parent and individual family. And I actually think really schools can be a really powerful force for change in their local communities, working with parents to delay these things and push them back out of childhood. And at the very least, they have a lot of influence over the school day and can do a lot to kind of protect that from the harms.
Yeah, I think Claire and I both agree that there are voluntary solutions that are part of having important conversations, and that those need to include parents, young people themselves, and other adult leaders and role models, such as teachers and schools. I also think, and I don't want to put words in her mouth, this hasn't come up, that Claire and I would agree that while we often have this conversation saying kids or teens or young people, that the expectations around a 5-year-old in kindergarten and a high school senior with regards to what those conversations look like, what access of technology we're talking about, may vary as well. You want young people to be able, when we aren't going to expect perhaps the same degree of restriction in high school that we are in kindergarten, because there are going to be beneficial uses, or there are going to be more unique scenarios that come up that need exception. Young people who are driving to school, for example, are going to have a different need for a smartphone than perhaps, the kindergartner whose parent is dropping them off. That's not to say that there are never exceptions, but that there is a kind of discussion to be had about, even in a voluntary policy framework, are we looking at a voluntary policy for all ages, or something that would depend on how the classroom or how the school or how the child is using that? I say that because I think that phone free schools or classrooms are one option that appeal to some parents, appeal to some educators, and appeal to some young people themselves who don't want to have the distraction there, and in some cases are one option. But there are also ways we've seen technology be used incredibly beneficial in the classroom, including technology that's available on smartphones or on school-issued devices like tablets. And so I think in that regard, we want to make sure that we aren't banning all technology from the classroom, which I don't think is something that Claire wants to do either. But that we are instead, looking at how do we teach young people to be responsible with the technology that they have access to. And I think some of that also comes from us as adults at time modeling what being responsible with your technology is like. FOSI, the Family Online Safety Initiative, has a series of great videos aimed at parents about having conversations around technology with their young people, for example. And some of that includes like your child or your student may call you out on how often are you checking your phone? How often are you able to put your phone away at the dinner table? Or if not, are you having that conversation with the family about, okay, dad's expecting or mom's expecting a work email right now. I'm going to have my phone out tonight. I understand that that's rude and that that's distracting, but I needed you to know that this is why I'm making an exception. And if you need an exception, like we can talk about that too, kind of thing. The reason I think doing this voluntarily and at a local level works better than at a top down level is we can all think of exceptional cases, many of which you may have encountered in your own classroom. A child who's using a smartphone to track some sort of medication or some sort of other health issue, a child who has special circumstances where there needs to be an emergency contact or something like that. And yes, there can be other solutions to that, but being able to deal with those things on a case by case basis is much more likely at a school level than in a top down level. And then I know one of the other things Claire and I agree on is on the role of education more generally, whether it's educating parents or educating young people themselves as they get older and encounter these technologies so that they're able to make the choices that best reflect, as I was saying, the right decisions for their family at different ages, as well as the right decisions as they start to be able to use those technologies themselves.
Can I just jump in really fast?
Please.
Yeah, just things that Jennifer was saying. We're just fomenting more thoughts. I was going to say, I do think that parents, I noticed in a lot of the comments, are often the source of pushback. And so I will say that I do think schools can actually help parents in this area. You were just talking about education. I actually think schools can help educate parents more on the harms, and particularly why a phone-free school day is so beneficial to students. And so we have put out, EPPC has put out resources actually trying to encourage schools, like, here are some responses to parents' concerns, how to navigate those. I think in particular, assuring parents if they need to get in touch with their child during the school day, they can call the main office. The classrooms have phones. They will make sure that message gets to the child, and vice versa. If a child needs to call a parent, they are able to make a phone accessible. And I do think, like, a lot of the policies I've worked on have had medical exemptions, working with the school nurse if a child needs access to a device for any type of medical need. But I will just push back a little bit, Jennifer, and say I'm not sure, like, the kind of benefits of tech in the classroom I have become more and more skeptical of. And I also think smartphones aren't really needed for that. If they have a tablet or Chromebook, or the teacher has something, then there really isn't a need for the students to have phones to participate in an activity. But I'm actually becoming increasingly convinced by the research that students just don't learn as well on screens. And there, of course, maybe needs to complete assignments on screens. But I think in terms of teaching, that especially the literacy building blocks, that kids really do learn better by writing things out by hand, by reading texts in print. A study from Columbia's Teachers College came out last year showing that children actually comprehend texts and understand them more deeply when they read them in paper than on a screen. And so I'm not saying there aren't times where teachers may need to use screens, but I actually think that we should be a little bit more questioning the benefits of technology, and actually asking if some of the older ways of doing things may in fact be better for children and how they learn. And I think you pointed this out earlier, it can also really vary by grade. So I would be pretty anti-tech in the classroom in elementary school, and then, middle school and high school, I think that changes. I'm very for them having some type of computer lab or a computer class where they're learning tech skills. I'm not anti-tech, and I'm certainly not anti-learning how to use the internet for research and purposes like that. But I do think that the kind of ed tech industry has really pushed this as like all screens for all ages all the time. And I do think that there's a role for questioning that, whether even in particular subject matter areas, if there are actually better ways for kids to learn in hands-on ways or engaging with the text and paper than having it all be put on the screen. So I just wanted to push back just slightly that I don't know if I'm as optimistic about the benefits of some of the texts that are being pushed in.
And Allan, just before we move on to the next question, if I could say, I just want to be clear. I apologize if I was overstating your position. I more was thinking
okay.
that my understanding was you were not a ban all computers and let's all go back to, handwriting everything. But instead, my understanding of your position is exactly what you said. It's going to depend on the nature of the classroom. A kindergarten phonics class and a high school, applied physics class are going to have very different technology needs. And you're not suggesting that, that while an individual school may say, for example, want to decide we're just going to be completely analog, that your position was more of we don't want the distraction of technology and we want to ensure that we're including critical thinking skills, but not a technology never serves a purpose in the classroom.
Yeah, that's
So
fair.
I do have just one more question for the two of you, but before I do, I wanted to briefly encourage those who are here tonight who haven't yet, if they have questions, please throw them in the chat. In just a few minutes, we're going to switch to Q&A and taking those as the basis for the remainder of our conversation this evening. So some great ones in there so far. Keep them coming. But Claire, Jennifer, the last question I've got for you both now is, we've heard some really compelling arguments from both of you about your positions. What I'd love to hear from each of you is what you take to be the most compelling argument of the other person's position. So Claire, the argument that Jennifer was making, what sounds most compelling to you? And Jennifer, in turn, of the arguments that Claire's making, which do you find most persuasive? Jennifer, let's start with you. Give Claire a second to think, and then we'll switch to her.
What's this room?
I think one thing, and I think in some ways this is a point of agreement actually, is the role that community can play in kind of norm setting around technology use. The idea of whether it's through coordination at a school or in another social group, parents, other adults, and young people themselves coming together. And yeah, that may let the parents make the school the scapegoat or something at some point. But at the end of the day, a parent can decide to have different rules at home than in a school. So it's not taking away that parental choice. And I think that's something that I do find compelling, because I think it's something that can be done on a very local level and something that can be done without a need for formal regulation, and something that can also vary from community to community. One of the problems that I often have with some of the more top-down approaches, even around conversations like what is age appropriate, is what is age appropriate is going to vary from community to community, or what age, even from, different backgrounds and things like that, what age is considered responsible enough or things like that. So I think really empowering communities to come together and have those conversations and say, this is kind of our norm within this group, and hopefully kind of empowering parents and young people as a result of that.
Thanks, Jennifer. Claire?
Yeah, I would say I think that Jennifer's points about, wanting to protect the kind of the individual kind of freedom and responsibility that we give to parents, I think that is compelling. Like, I certainly wouldn't be arguing for top-down approaches that are trying to kind of undermine, individual responsibility or parental freedoms, particularly in their home or their families. And so I do think it's a compelling argument to make sure that as we're considering solutions, we don't want to be inadvertently somehow undermining kind of parental autonomy and individual freedom. So I definitely think it's important to kind of make sure we're weighing those things. And I really have tried to do that in the solutions I've advocated for. We don't want the state to be replacing the parent. So a lot of the solutions that I have tried to kind of put forward have been with the aim to really come alongside and support parents. And as I mentioned, I think schools are really well poised to do that. And I do think there is a role for laws. So that's probably where Jennifer and I disagree on some of these things, is that I am a little bit more in favor of providing some collective solutions through the law in ways based on precedents and how we've handled things that we deem harmful for children before, recognizing they don't have the same rights as adults. And there are areas where the state does exert some authority over that is a little bit above and beyond a parent's authority. That, I mean, I suppose a parent could still buy their child alcohol, but the child can't buy it. They're taking that decision away essentially from the parent. And so I think the same could be said with some of these digital technologies. If the parent really wanted their child to use it, they could obviously do that, but just trying to provide more of a collective solution. But I certainly agree with Jennifer's points about not wanting to do anything that infringes on adults' rights, adult speech, or undermines that individual responsibility of the parents.
Well, thank you both so much for the candid and civil conversation so far. Really excited about the way you've been engaging different points of view and finding both areas of overlap, but also a shared understanding where you disagree. Lots of interesting questions that came in. I want to go back to one that Matt Allender shared earlier on in the chat. So Matt had said, let's say that tomorrow the social media platforms were made to require parent permission for the kids to create an account. Logistically, how could this be verified? Kids are creative and will find workarounds to roadblocks, firewalls, and so on. Or like so many in my generation, we're the ones who had to turn it on for our parents to be able to limit our access to things. So how would that work when it comes to, we'll call it blanket sort of technological verification, whether for age or permission? How might those things work? Is there good reason they could, or is there reason to think that they might be susceptible to some of the more traditional flaws that are associated here? Jennifer, you've been I'm sorry.
I was gonna say I want to
yeah.
I want to jump in almost immediately on this, and because I do think, and I'm guessing this is something Claire and I will agree on, some of what it means to comply with these laws or policies is going to depend on the specific of the law and the policy, and it's also going to depend on the liability that the company might face for violating the policy, whether that's litigation or civil penalties under the law. And I say that because we've seen a variety from what you commonly see now, which is kind of the enter a birth date. And, if your parent wants to say you're 13 when you're 12, like you can kind of do the math type of things. In some cases, there's very little checks, even if you are required to be 13. It's kind of that traditional putting your birthday to access the site. The next step is some sort of age assurance, which usually involves either some degree of photo identification or some degree of facial scan that kind of looks at a picture of someone and says, you appear to be about a certain age. Depending on the nature of the technology, how accurate this is can vary. And it also raises concerns for individuals who might naturally look young or who might have a disability or be from certain groups where this technology is not as accurate at trying to guesstimate their age. Or it even can look at things like behavior. What are you interacting with on this website? Is there a reason that we think that you're younger than perhaps you say you are? The concerns there, of course, are privacy related as well, both for the potential use of biometrics in some cases, as well as the fact that this could actually involve more tracking of interactions, let alone, the impact it could have on, say, someone who perhaps has a developmental disability but is on an online service and is presumed to be younger than they actually are. The final step, and the one that I think is most concerning to many of us who work on free speech issues or on privacy issues, is literal verification, whether it's for parents or for identity. These are the type of things that require some sort of actual ID to be scanned into a database in order to get an account. In the case of parental verification, it could require the parent's ID to be scanned in, some sort of proof of parenthood, like a birth certificate or an adoption certificate, to be scanned in to prove you are the parent of the child as well, which then creates a lot of data that's out there that many people would be concerned about the vulnerability of, let alone the concerns that what that would do for anonymous speech. The fact that I know many people are concerned about anonymous speech online, but there are also people for whom being able to speak anonymously or pseudonymously, in other words, under a username, is significantly protective because of areas of their identity because they're a whistleblower, because they're concerned about certain other information getting out there about them for their own physical safety in some cases. And so I certainly think that that raises many concerns about the potential impact on both speech and privacy. And what does make this different than some of the other examples that often come up, issues around, we require an ID to buy beer or wine, or we require you to be 16 to get a car or to get a driver's license or whatever, is that being on the internet, engaging with social media is an expressive activity. That is a First Amendment protected activity in a way that drinking alcohol or buying cigarettes is not.
Okay, I can just respond. I really like concrete examples because it just really helps me. So I've worked a lot with states on some of these laws, and I will just say that the technology exists to do this in a way that is privacy protecting and at the same way in a way that is actually effective. That means that it actually keeps minors from finding all these loopholes and workarounds. And so I love to talk about the example of Louisiana. They kind of years ago established a digital ID program. And so now in their state, you can verify your age using their digital ID program with a two-step method that actually then reveals no underlying information about yourself to the website. You're visiting a website, and if it's age restricted, and it'll say like, oh, do you have Louisiana wallet, digital ID? And you can just say, yes, I do. And then it will send you, you can open up the digital wallet app on your phone. It'll send a code. It'll say, okay, you can input this code to the website. We've verified that, yes, this person is over 18. And so that's the only information that the website receives is just yes or no, this person is over 18. And so I think there are more and more methods available now, particularly like even when you're setting up a device on your phone. I'm encouraged about more and more solutions that would be kind of conducting verification when you configure a device and then saves a token or a zero knowledge proof key like on the phone that can then communicate to websites or applications, yes or no, this person is over the age of 18 or not. And I think really what we have to realize is that our virtual world and our real world have really grown further and further apart, and that the way that we understand when someone is an adult or a minor in the real world needs to translate to the virtual world because of online pornography websites, because of social media platforms that we might deem harmful to minors. And there are technological means to do this enables us to keep children safe while also allowing adults access to speech that they're rightfully able to access. And so I also think there's another approach that Florida has taken, which instead of doing verification, requiring that from companies on the front end for social media platforms, they have just said that when basically when a social media platform determines, based on all the massive amounts of data that they're collecting, that an account is a minor, they have to kick it off unless the minor can show that they've obtained parental consent or that they're over a certain age, like over 16, they don't have to then prove anything. And so I think that's another interesting approach. Instead of a kind of age gating it at the front, they're trying to protect this thing, protect on the back end, and kind of creates an ongoing responsibility that if they understand there's an account of a minor, they have to obtain some proof or verification. And I think in terms of obtaining the parental consent, which is the approach a lot of these states have taken, that there are ways that this can be done as well. And I would even say on the age verification part too, I gave that example of Louisiana Wallet. Most of the bills that I've worked on, we try to offer several ways an adult could do that, so that they can choose, that the user can choose, and offering ways that are really privacy protecting. But Louisiana's bill had some very kind of clever things in there, like having basically a phone number a parent can call and explain, like, this is my child, I'm verifying for them, and that really wouldn't reveal any information that's retained anywhere, or inputting an email where they are sent like a link. I think that there are a lot of means that we could explore, and that the technology exists to do this, but we just really haven't put a lot of energy into this yet. And I'm encouraged that the technologies have developed, that I think there's lots of ways this can be done that are both privacy protecting for adults, but that really solve a critical need, which is how to know when someone is a minor online. and trying to create a safe internet experience then for children.
We've had a handful of questions come up in the chat on various themes, like social media in particular is harmful for children because X. So it might be access to pornography, it might be images of violence, it might be access to otherwise harmful information. So that is one sort of category. A second category seems to be broadly along the lines of it seems to make them worse students, right? So it's distracting, it harms attention spans, it bleeds into their ability to perform higher level thinking activities when they get into college or careers, so on. So broadly under the umbrella of access to these kinds of things is creating bad situations for young people. I'm cautious of going too far down the line of asking either of you to speak too much about the veracity of a variety of medical studies or cases. But broadly, I'll throw it to either of you to the extent that you're comfortable talking about it. To what extent do you find those conversations compelling? Like, that is to say, do you find the evidence that you've heard or seen in these cases compelling? Or to what extent do you feel it doesn't really seem to bear out, or if it bears out, it's not exactly clear that it's social media that is the causal factor behind some of these kinds of things that we're seeing? Claire, let me turn to you first. I know you'd mentioned in some extent you thought some of these pieces were compelling. There's some measure of addictiveness that seems to be shown by brain scans. What else might you say in this broad trend? To what extent we ought to think, is this a source or a cause of some of the harms that people seem to be seeing?
Yeah, so I would certainly say that it is. I've become very convinced by the research, and I'll just say briefly, like, I think that kind of the twofold issue is that the design itself is addicting and is inherently harmful to a child's brain development, and the kinds of content that are being fed to them on social media are also often very dangerous. And I think just understanding that those things are actually intertwined, that the business model, because it's trying to keep people hooked as long as possible, the types of things it generates through the algorithms are the things that it thinks will appeal to people. And often what that means is that a lot of sexual or violent or drug related content is getting promoted because people are clicking on this, people are watching it. And so it's kind of sadly really preying on kind of human vulnerability and things that we may be drawn to, and particularly children who are very impressionable and curious might click on. And so I think that the algorithms themselves are feeding really dangerous content into children's feeds to try to keep them on the platforms as long as possible. I feel I do think that some of the challenges and some of the studies have been trying to disentangle, like, oh, is this a clear, like, this amount of time spent on social media led to then this mental health harm? I think that those studies, it's harder to find a very like conclusive, like it was this that caused this, when they look at a very isolated variable, like just time on one social media platform. But it's more complicated than that. And Jonathan Haidt has made that point, that when you actually zoom out though and look at this entire phone-based childhood, and that they're on all these different apps, not just this one social media platform, I think it becomes a lot more compelling, the kind of mental health harms that we're seeing bear out in the data. And one study really even showed that the younger the age of first smartphone, the worse the mental health outcomes over time. And I think the longitudinal studies are really the most compelling when they're tracking this over years. And it found that children who got smartphones at younger ages had worse mental health outcomes as young adults. Particularly, the most the like metric that was the most affected was actually the rate of suicide or suicidal ideation being a lot higher the younger the age of first smartphone. And I think some of the other studies that have looked at social media and mental health have been for shorter periods of time and have been like a really, as I mentioned, like kind of isolated variable. But when you zoom out and you also consider, like I mentioned before, the network effects, Jonathan Haidt has explained that I think some of the challenges with some of these scientific studies was that they were designed for what he calls a dose response relationship, where which we do in the medical field. Okay, you get this dose, what's the effect? And doing that with social media doesn't necessarily work because, as I mentioned, there's these network effects, that it's not just necessarily how much time you spent per day on the platform, but the fact that now your entire social environment is mediated through this. And maybe you only spend 30 minutes, but you're still really struggling from anxiety or depression because of how it's changed the social environment. And so it's a little bit difficult in some of these studies to disentangle the impact. But for me, when you look at the broader picture of what has happened over time with the advent of smartphone and social media, and then what's happening to young people and their mental health today, and when we look at the social environment and the ways that's changed, and when we see how the smartphone and its apps have become such a part of childhood and how addicting that is, that has really convinced me of the harms.
So if I can start by pointing out something I think, and Claire, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, that we both agree on, is that this is a very complicated question when it comes to young people's mental health, smartphones, social media, what's going on, and that it's one that needs that the current studies don't necessarily fully satisfy. That there is, you mentioned a longitudinal problem, the kind of dose response problem. I think where we differ is in kind of how we see what perhaps some of those further studies and understanding need to be. So one of the concerns I have about some of these studies is the inability to, for example, really examine everything going on in a young person's life beyond that smartphone. It's, a very difficult, as we were saying, to isolate a single variable, whether it's the amount of time spent on a specific app or the introduction of the smartphone in many of these cases. These are going to be complicated stories. I do want to pick up on something else, though, from the question Allan asked, which is more about the kind of what should we do about specific types of content, whether it's violent content. I know I saw that come up a few times in the chat. I know there's also been particularly a lot of conversation around things like eating disorder content or drug use or things like that in young people online. And I want to start, as I always do when I talk about this topic, by recognizing that there are some absolutely heartbreaking stories out there of young people who have had negative experiences online, of adults who have had negative experiences online with some content that for them was, at least, whether we would consider it harmful as a society or not, at least for them on an individual level, was very harmful. Now's when I get to the more complicated side of this question, though, which is that in most of these cases, if we say broad categories such as content about dieting, content about drugs, content about violence, we're actually going to take away a lot of information that may actually be very valuable, including to people struggling with some of these very difficult issues. So, for example, one can consider how, eating disorder recovery content might be needed, but get flagged the same way that eating disorder content does. Body positivity content might get flagged the same way that eating disorder content does. Things about how to help a friend struggling with drug addiction might get flagged as drug-related content. And I think I saw that we have several history teachers in the audience tonight. You can easily imagine how, if you're trying to show film clips from war, that could get flagged as violent content. And yes, one can say, well, we can make some sort of exception for the good side, but that's going to make it very hard on a platform that's the one that's having to host this content to distinguish every post, and is going to probably silence a lot of positive content along with that harmful content as well. And in a way, if it's being done through a government policy, is likely to potentially violate the First Amendment.
Excellent. So almost out of time. Claire, I want to give you the last question from KN there, because I feel like you have an answer to it. Is there a toolkit available to educators that would like to pitch the phone-free idea to their schools? I have a phone-free room, but I'm the only one that requires students to check in on their mobile devices.
That is so hard. I do think that it's really hard to have it just be a classroom at a time. So yes, there's a toolkit. I don't know if I guess toolkit's the right word, but we put out a resource from EPPC, a very kind of comprehensive long policy paper with really all the kind of research and lay of the land called Getting Phones Out of Schools. And then accompanying that is a 4-page resource really geared towards parents and educators. Kind of here's the most important data to press home about how it helps with discipline issues, how it helps improve academic outcomes, social outcomes, and here's kind of responses to parents' common objections. So that resource, those are all on the EPBC website, and I think Allan can send out a link to those. But I would also mention two other organizations that I would look up is the Phone Free School Movement. They have exactly what you asked for. They have a toolkit for educators, and then they also have a toolkit for administrators that has a lot of the things that I mentioned, which is just ideas for model policies, kind of practical resources for schools. And then the last one I'll mention is the Smartphone Free Childhood Movement, started in the UK, is now also in the US. They have a lot of great, just like model templates of a model letter a principal could send out, model policies for the school to adopt on these things. And so no one needs to reinvent the wheel or try to do this from scratch. There are organizations out there trying to help equip schools, educators, administrators, and how they could adopt something like this in their school. So those would be my top recommendations.
Very briefly, one final question for both of you. In thinking about where we go from here, what makes you most optimistic? So in a stretch of time where things are particularly challenging for educators and schools, and challenges that are brought by social media and tech policy, among many, many other pieces, as you think about the lay of the land in front of you and you look ahead and say, here's what gives me hope. What's your short message of hope to the teachers here tonight? Jennifer?
I think we're seeing an increasing amount of choice around this, and that's what actually gives me hope. Whether it's devices designed specifically for young people to resolve some of the parental concerns, whether it's the fact that, we see schools kind of being little laboratories and trying different policies and figuring out what works well, because in some cases, you may want a very technologically enriched school for your child. And in other cases, you may be very concerned about the distraction. And so really ensuring that parents in an ideal world have a variety of choices that can meet their needs. And I think the other thing is an increasing awareness around whether you want to call it education or transparency on what those choices and options are, whether it's resources for teachers and parents and guides on how to have conversations, whether it's the kind of parental controls available on individual apps, that because of the concerns expressed by parents, we are seeing a response not on a kind of market-based level where we are seeing these options out there, and that we're also, like I said, ideally seeing options amongst schools and classrooms.
Claire, same question.
Yeah, I would just say that I think what gives me the greatest hope is this phone-free school movement. I think that I'm really encouraged by schools kind of taking the reins and really leading the culture and leading the country to try to push these things out of childhood. And they've just done tremendous good for parents. And so now several states have gone phone-free across their state, or really large school districts have gone phone-free. And what is encouraging to me are the benefits being reported out of these states and school districts and schools, how teachers just see such a huge improvement, not only in students' focus in the classroom and their academics, but in their social engagement and interactions with peers, and respect for teachers increasing and having a lot less discipline issues, less bullying, and just a better school environment and school day. And I would just say the second thing that encourages me is state governments in the US really stepping up and taking on this challenge. I think, we've talked about really kind of starting at the local level, and a lot of states have been passing laws to try to support parents on these issues. As I mentioned, some states passing legislation to go phone free in their schools, or also parental consent for social media or age verification for pornography websites, all aimed to really try to help parents in a really difficult age where this technology is ever present, try to preserve a really real life embodied childhood in the real world, and helping foster friendships and real life activities for their kids. So I'm encouraged, and I think the tide is turning.
Claire, Jennifer, thank you both so much for joining us for tonight's conversation. Really appreciated hearing your insights, and particularly the way in which a time where civility seems to be nowhere to be found, the two of you thoughtfully engage each other on the ideas and that showed that measure of respect. So thank you again both so much for being a model of what we're trying to do here with Sphere. 2 quick points for the teachers joining us this evening as we wrap up. One, for those of you who are alumni of Sphere programming, I do want to encourage you, if you haven't yet, to consider applying for the Sphere Alumni Fellowship. Our spring cohort will start here in April. There's still time and just a little bit of space left. If you're curious, go to the Sphere website, sphere-egg.org. You can find information about the Sphere Alumni Fellowship there. Second, I did want to encourage you all, again, thank you so much for participating in this conversation as a part of Civic Learning Week. Take that opportunity over the course of the rest of this week to try and, you might say, recharge your civics batteries. That is, engage with organizations, conversation, groups participating in this with the many incredible resources supporting educators all throughout this week, and for many of these organizations all throughout the year, often free, available to everyone in all subjects in all areas. So thank you all again so much for being here tonight. We'll go ahead and wrap the conversation for this evening. Next Sphere webinar, you can look to be March 25th. And just as a quick hit on that one, advertisement will be coming out soon. It'll be on the impact of women in economics. So a fantastic conversation with some female economists who've been doing incredible work to advance the field. That'll be March 25th. More information coming soon. Thank you again all so much for being here tonight. Have a great evening.